Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Mandy.
How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
A little bit stressed.
Hopefully we can deal with that by the end of this.
Sure.
Can you introduce yourself for...
Yes, so I'm Jim Gillespie. I've lived in Maritzburg now for 48 years. Married to Nikki, who's a friend of yours, gymming together.
I think it's because you don't have any knowledge of what I do or how I do it or why. So I just thought
No history.
you're a blank slate.
Okay.
And also you ask good questions. You've always been a curious guy, and
Okay.
I've always enjoyed our conversations.
Well, let's see how it goes.
Yep.
Okay. So, Mandy, can you tell me why you have chosen to focus on stress and burnout as your niche in coaching?
Yeah, well, I have a history of physiotherapy. I was a physiotherapist for 30 years. And as a result of that, I worked on a lot of bodies that had become injured or developed, people who developed headaches and backache from sitting too much at work and the stresses that they get at work. So having that experience, and then over the sort of the COVID time, I did a degree in psychology. And while I was studying the degree in psychology, I realized that there was this link, this connection between the mind and the body with the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is that part of your nervous system that runs everything automatically, your heart rate, your breathing, your digestive system. So what I realized is that because of this connection, the mind actually mirrors the body and the body mirrors the mind, which means that if you are stressed, if you're anxious or angry in your thoughts, then that means your body's going to reflect that. And the physiology of your body is going to change. The muscle tension's going to change, your breathing's going to change, your voice is going to change. Everything changes with every sort of emotional nuance you have. So when I realized that connection, and also knowing my experience with the physiology, I realized that there's a huge prevalence of burnout at the moment. It's almost a pandemic in itself. That having that knowledge of this mind-body connection, the only way that you can really deal with burnout is by addressing the sort of the thoughts in the mind and what's going on in the body emotionally and physiologically as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how would people know that they might be experiencing burnout and stress? How would we actually recognize it?
Well, one of the first things is that often the people that come to me are sent to me by a spouse or a boss because they have been very snappy and tetchy at work or at home. Or what they do when they get home is that they go and isolate. They arrive home, they're very sullen, and they just go and isolate in a study and hide behind a screen or distract themselves with their cell phones. Anything just to try and get away from the stresses of life. So people come to me, because they're sent. And then also the other symptoms that they often develop is things like difficulty sleeping. Either they can't fall asleep, they wake up really early and can't go back to sleep, or they wake up feeling exhausted. They don't feel like they've really got a good night's rest. So health challenges are definitely another reason, because that has a snowball effect and causes other health issues. So that's also another reason why people will come to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that people, after they leave work, they go to the club or the gym for half an hour before they go home, is that a way of handling their stress at work that day?
Absolutely. In the old days, people used to stop at the pub for a pint on the way home. And that was great for them because that enabled them to debrief with their colleagues.
Yeah.
And, everybody validated their feelings and their experiences from the day. They could get it all out. And then they could go home. And when they arrived home, they were calm enough that they could actually engage with their families.
Okay.
So that's no longer, some people still do it, of course, but it's no longer really appropriate today. So what's taken its place is stopping at the gym or going for a yoga class or just going for a walk in nature with a friend that, time in nature and social engagement, all of those sort of things help to calm your nervous system and to sort of complete the stress process so that you can kind of work out all the energy that stress causes in your body, work it out, so by the time you get home, you actually somebody worth connecting with.
Okay. What symptoms would you recognize when you meet someone who is obviously suffering from stress and burnout?
You know, one of the things that people notice is at work, the people that are burning out are generally burning out because they're overusing their compensation patterns. So, for example, somebody who's a people pleaser, you know, they really struggle to say no. And as a result, they take on too much, whether it's at home or at work. You know, they take on too many projects, they're overcommitted, and they end up exhausting themselves. The other sort of compensation patterns might be something like perfectionism or control. You know, you get those people who can't stand for there to be any sort of like anger or upset in an environment. So they're constantly peacekeeping. They're running from one person to the next, trying to keep the peace, trying to keep everybody calm. And, you know, that can be exhausting after a while. It's you can see it as a superpower, you know, if you perfectionism, control, peacekeeping, all of these things are your superpowers as well. They're really beautiful attributes. But when they become a compulsion and you have to do it and there's no way of satisfying it, that's when it starts to burn you out. And the more stressed people become, the more they run these compulsive patterns, the more likely they are to start burning out. And they don't only stress themselves out, but it stresses everybody else out around them because they drive everybody crazy.
So why is it so difficult, can you just tell us a little bit more about, to say no to something? Some people say, you know, they yes to everything. Why is it so difficult to say no to somebody who asks you for something or wants your time?
Yeah. So it's interesting because, you know, for people who compulsively absolutely cannot say no, you know, I've worked with people who they just become too stressed and overwhelmed if they even try and say no. You can often trace that compulsion. It's a compensation mechanism. So you've got to ask yourself, what is it compensating for? And you can't solve the problem in the present. You can't just say to that person, stop being so silly, just say no, okay? It would be the same as trying to say to somebody, stop eating so much, you know, just you know, go on a diet. Or somebody, stop being so depressed, just pull yourself out of it. It's not possible to solve the problem in the present. You have to go and figure out where that compensation pattern originated and what it's compensating for. And that generally originated in childhood. So you have to go and look at that situation and resolve that before they can, and because there'll be cross wires there on how they interpret different situations. And once you've helped them to resolve that, then they no longer have to show up as the people pleaser in the present.
So you're saying that things that happened to us 50, 60 years ago still manifest today in how we relate to things?
Yes, absolutely. Just about everything that triggers you and pushes you into one of these patterns where, you know, maybe it's somebody who offends you, and to stop them from offending you, you might get loud and angry and in their faces. That's a pattern you would have learnt as a child. Say they're offending you and your strategy is to get up and walk out. That's a different pattern. That would have been a different situation as a child. You know, so everybody has their way of coping and dealing with stresses and triggers in their lives. And generally, if you want to get to the bottom of it, they would have come up with that idea as a child. It would have worked for them in their childhood very effectively. And then it became an unconscious coping mechanism. And now in their adulthood, it's probably not working so well. It's probably causing problems in their relationships or problems at work. And now they need to do something about it.
Can you explain to me why some people seem to cope and others completely fall apart and get overwhelmed in stressful situations?
It's a good question, Jim. I think it's because our perception of a stressful situation is different for everybody. You know, the way you perceive something is very different from the way I perceive something, and it's all dependent on our past experience. So an example would be, if somebody came in here with a non-venomous snake and asked us to pet it, like, I don't know how you'd feel about that, but I'm terrified of snakes, so I would probably run.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. But some people are perfectly comfortable petting snakes.
Okay.
I don't know how you feel about bungee jumping, but some people are perfectly comfortable jumping off a platform hundreds of meters from the ground with a small rope tied around their feet.
Yeah.
My nervous system would never allow me
Okay.
to do that.
So people are just different.
People are different.
Okay.
The other thing is something like a messy room. When you walk into a messy room, how does that make you feel? And how does that make you respond?
Yeah.
Because for some people, they won't even notice it. And for another person, that would stress
Very
them
stressful.
out. And it would create a problem in the workplace or in the household.
Okay.
Household.
Okay. Is there something from our history that influences our minds in stressful situations?
Absolutely. Most of the time, when you look at somebody's compensation pattern, that something that somehow that they're showing up dysfunctionally, maybe they have anger issues, or maybe they've got anxiety, or that the people pleasing, or the perfectionism, or the controlling, any one of those things, you can generally, if you reverse engineer it with them, you can actually find a time in their childhood where that behavior really helped them to adapt and stay safe in sometimes very volatile environments. So an example might be if a child grew up in a household where the parents fought all the time. That's terrifying to a child. There's all sorts of risks involved. It might make the child remember that one of their friends' parents got divorced, and then the child suffered as a result of that. So immediately the child goes into fight and flight and starts to try and regulate its parents' nervous systems by behaving in certain ways. So they might control the environment so that the parent never gets upset. So maybe, a dirty kitchen upsets one of the parents, and then they have a go at the other one. So that child will make sure that the kitchen is always spotless. It might be that, they need to soothe the parent by performing, So they'll distract the parents by being, really good at sport or performing at academics to try and keep the parents even-tempered. Another thing that they might do is become act out and become dysfunctional themselves to try and get the parents to sort of join together and work together as a team to solve the problem of the child.
So our childhood experiences shape the way we handle stress as adults.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a big responsibility to bring a child into the world. You need to be prepared to make sure you give them the coping mechanisms.
Yeah, that's, a lot of parents, when they hear this, they suddenly say, oh my goodness, now I'm going to have to be careful how I behave in front of my children, and I've already traumatized them. We're forever having blow-ups, or, we're stressed in the morning getting kids to school. It can be a very hectic environment. So they immediately become concerned that they're traumatizing and scarring their children for life. Whereas if you think about it, the last thing you want is to actually overprotect your children, wrap them in cotton wool, and then when they turn 18 or 21, release them into the world completely unprepared to deal with exactly that kind of situation. Because the working world is not going to be all, love and kindness.
Yeah.
There are going to be some very volatile people out there. So childhood is the way of preparing them for that. So if you have a volatile household where there is some shouting and there is some people, losing it with each other, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the way that you help the child deal with it that matters. So if you can teach the child that after an argument where people are shouting and screaming at each other, that there is love, that there is safety, and kneel down next to them and put your arms around them and reassure them that everything's going to be okay, and ask them about their feelings. How did that make them feel? Where did they feel it? Then you're actually building emotional intelligence into that child. Instead of what happened when we were kids, our parents didn't know that. We were pretty much abandoned to our own resources.
Sure.
And as a result of that, if you were 8 years old with your little 8-year-old mind, you went and figured out how to feel okay. And most of the time, your brain wasn't developed enough to figure it out, so you just suppressed it. And it will come out later in your life and as dysfunctional behavior.
Okay. What makes some people choose dysfunctional, self-sabotaging strategies in their childhood? Why did they choose to go that route?
You know, you've got to remember that it's self-sabotaging and dysfunctional as an adult. But when you look at the decision that the child made and the intention it made it with at the time, it was actually really perfectly adapted to the situation it was in. It was actually highly intelligent. And it really makes a difference when somebody can see this, because, you know, in our adulthood, when we're behaving badly, you know, you've just had a meltdown, you've screamed and shouted at someone and said some things that you wished you hadn't. You may have, your inner critic may berate you for that and beat you up and, you know, to call you stupid and an idiot and whatever, because it is dysfunctional behavior. You've affected that relationship. But when you reverse engineer it to to childhood and why the child came up with that behavior to protect itself, you realize that actually it was highly intelligent, and that it was often the only decision that the child could make. So often, if it is an angry outburst, that usually comes from teenage years. So a child who has felt either shamed or fearful, or in some kind of or hurt when they're little, in a difficult family situation or school situation. It's not always in the family. When they get to teenage years, they suddenly get their voice and realize that if they get big and loud and angry, people leave them alone. So they use that as a compensation mechanism. And if it works for them, it's often the only way that they can stop people from hurting them or scaring them. So if it works for them, they continue to use it. By the time that, 3 or 4 decades later, it's become their go-to pattern. Anybody threatens them, they just get in their faces and shout. It gets the other person to back down. It works.
Okay.
But it doesn't engender good relationships. So sometimes they need to do something about it and find a more adaptable way of...
More appropriate.
Or appropriate way of interacting.
What is it in children that makes them respond the way they do?
It's interesting you ask that, Jim, because, to understand our adult behavior, we have to reverse engineer it and understand our behavior as children. Why we show up as controlling or performing or people pleasing. But to understand why children respond that way and the coping mechanisms that they choose, you have to actually understand cave child and the way that cave child was wired to survive in an African savanna. You always have to remember that we're all born with the same nervous system as a wild cave child, and we perfectly adapted to live and survive on a wild African savanna with wild cave parents and a wild cave clan. But from day one, we have to adapt to a modern world, and the rules in the modern world are completely different. So when you look at how a child is responding to a situation, you have to understand why it would want to behave in that situation in a cave clan. So if you look at a cave clan and the children in a cave clan, they have to survive in this African savanna, and the children had to behave in a certain way so that they wouldn't attract predators and so that everybody could work together. Because unfortunately in those days, we didn't have the resources that we have today, the hospitals and the social services and things like that. And very often, if there was a child that was delinquent in some way or dysfunctional in some way, maybe even handicapped, and was a burden to the tribe, very often they would have to be left behind.
Wow.
So, tragic. And what do you think happens if a child gets left behind on the African savanna?
Not going to last long.
It's not going to last long. So any kind of hint of being rejected in any way to a child is a death threat to the child, because it's wired to know that any kind of rejection would land up with it dying. And as a result, children are very wired instinctively to appease the parents, to make sure that they behave and belong, so that they can belong to the tribe, so that they can contribute to the tribe, so that they're very wired to be the good girl or be the good boy, so that they're never the one. If there's a shortage of food, or the clan has to move quickly because there's a marauding tribe coming, they're never the one that gets left behind. So it's hugely scary for a child to face any situation where maybe something might happen where they might be rejected. The other thing to bear in mind is that if anything happens to their parents, they might also get rejected, because if one of their parents dies and the other one has to partner up with somebody else, and that person, you know, and then they have children together, sometimes you become the extra one.
Yeah.
And if there's any shouting in the tribe as well, in the clan, adults shouting symbolizes, it's like our alarm call. Adults shouting symbolize danger. And any kind of danger might, if something happens to the adults in the clan, then that means your life is going to be at risk, because there may be no adults to protect you, or there may not be enough adults to look after you, and some of the children get left behind. So it's interesting, because they've done some studies with even modern hunter-gatherer tribes that don't have resources, and they often will have to let a child go if it's a burden for the tribe and they don't have enough food, and somebody has to be left behind. So you just have to understand that as a child, they still feel those instincts. And even though they're perfectly safe in the modern world, I mean, even if their parents get divorced, they're not going to die. You know, if there's a bit of a shortage of food, there's ways of keeping them safe. So in the modern world, it's not a real threat. It's a false threat. But to a child, it feels and looks like a real threat, and therefore they respond as if it's a real threat.
Okay. Do you think adults handle rejection any better than kids?
No. Have you found other adults handling rejection any better than kids?
Probably not.
No, if you look at your friends. But the reason for that is because unless you actually heal that, unless you can figure this out, then it stays in our bodies, in our nervous system. It doesn't get processed unless somebody teaches you how to process it. And that's what coaching's about. We come into adulthood with all of these coping mechanisms, and often if they don't work for us, we make the mistake of just doing them more, doubling down, and doing more and more until we burn out, rather than pausing and just saying, oh, hang on, this really isn't working for me. Maybe I need to get help.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So where do we start to fix this, or do we have to revisit our childhoods, even if they were dysfunctional?
Yeah, you can never really solve a problem in the present, like these kinds of problems, because they don't make sense. It doesn't make sense why somebody's not saying no. You know, it doesn't make sense why somebody's depressed. It doesn't make sense why they're constantly anxious. Can't they see that it's safe? You know, if somebody's having a panic attack, you can't just say to them, you silly boy, you know, why are you having a panic attack? You know, can't you see that you're safe? It's not logical. It's emotional, and it's deeply embedded in the nervous system. Your body is responding to the environment as if there's a threat. And often it's unconscious, so we don't know why. The only way that you can resolve it is by actually reverse engineering it to the earliest memory you have of using that coping mechanism, or that compensation mechanism. And when you can look at the situation from the perspective of the child, remembering that a child's brain is not developed like yours. You can't look at it from your perspective. You look at it from the perspective of an 8-year-old. How would an 8-year-old interpret the situation? Then when it makes sense to you, that's what helps you to heal it, because now you understand. Now in the present, in your adult life, if you have an angry outburst or you become anxious, you can now understand it. You can go, I know why I'm anxious. It's because of this is very similar to the situation I had when I was 8 or 9, or this is similar to a situation I had as a teenager, and my body's remembering it, and I'm responding the
even though you may not remember that happened in your childhood, it's still somewhere in your brain.
Yeah, so, you know, accessing these memories is quite difficult. And when you learn more about this, which is what I teach in the coaching, is that our nervous systems are actually beautifully wired. Because what happens is that we get triggered by something. Somebody said something offensive.
Yeah.
We feel offended. We get angry.
It can be just
or
one
we
word.
get anxious. Yeah, whatever. You know, the smallest thing can set us off. You know what it's like.
Yeah.
You've lived long enough. These things bother us, and it triggers a feeling in our body, an emotion. And if you tune into that emotion and the sensations it produces in your body, that actually helps you to open up the memory of your earliest memory of when that happened. Otherwise, it's all unconscious. We don't remember it. On a daily basis, you forget all the things that happened to you in childhood.
Yeah.
So this is a way of accessing that memory, is actually through your body and those sensations in the body. And the way it works is very similar to, you know, if you and I were socializing and I told you a story about a dog that bit me when I was, you know, on holiday last year. Suddenly all the stories you have of dogs biting you or other people will come to mind, and you'll want to tell your stories, because the closer you get to wherever that memory is stored, whether it's your brain or your body, we're not sure yet, the more it opens up the memories in that area. So often what happens if I say to people, can you think of the earliest memory? They'll go to a memory maybe in their 20s. But while they're telling that story, it'll remind them of a situation in their teens. And while they're telling that story, it'll actually take them down into their childhood. And then that memory will start to come up, and they'll be like, oh, hang on, I remember this one incident. And it might be a small thing. It's not necessarily a majorly traumatic incident. One guy, it was his grandparents telling him to go and play outside. It's not, they loved him, he loved them.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful relationship. But that little boy at the age of 4, for some reason, interpreted that as him being a burden on the family.
Sure. So how far can that go back to a child? Is it like a year old, 2 years old, 4 years old, 10 years? Can it go back to very young?
Yeah, so, you know, they're still researching it. It can definitely go back to 4 years old. You know, our memory only comes online, our factual memory only comes online when we're about 3 or 4 years old. So we have something called infant amnesia of the time before that, which means that we won't be able to remember the incident so well. And even if we do, we'll have difficulty articulating it, because it's only when you get to sort of 7 or 10 years old that you can actually give language and describe how you're feeling to an adult. Before that age, the adult actually has to give you the words. But the research that's really interesting that they're doing at the moment is looking before that. So memory is not only stored as facts, which is the hippocampus is the part of the brain that stores it. It's also stored emotionally in another part of the brain called the amygdala. And that comes online much earlier, in utero actually. So you have emotional memory of things that happened in utero, stresses that your mother might have been under, and then you have emotional memory of the time before you turned 3 or 4, which means that sometimes the memory is just a feeling. Sometimes you might get some vague shapes or colors involved with it, or hear tones of voices that might affect you. But what that means is that if you were traumatized between the ages of 0 and 2, say it was by somebody with a certain tone of voice, then decades later, that same tone of voice will put you into fight and flight. But you won't remember why, because you wouldn't have had the facts to go with it.
Okay.
But you can still process
That's
it.
incredible. Then it seems it's okay to openly admit that we are stressed nowadays and not coping, while 20 or 30 years ago it was completely taboo. We never would admit we were struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of reasons for that. One of the things I always tell my clients, because with this kind of going to childhood and looking for reasons in the childhood, what that can lead to is becoming a situation where we put all the blame on our parents, and then go into victim mode. Oh, woe is me, my parents were so horrendous or neglected me, and as a result I am the way I am today. Whereas we want to create a more empowered, free human being in the present. So you need to understand, first of all, that our parents were raised by parents who fought in a war, who were raised by parents who fought in a war, who were raised by parents who fought in a war. And you can keep going back in history until probably cave person days. So to just understand that at a sort of in a more modern level, what that meant was, if you think about the Second World War, the people coming back from the Second World War, all bar like maybe 1%, if we're lucky, of them, all of them had PTSD, full-blown PTSD, the whole lot. Some of them were hospitalized, some of them committed suicide. In those days, the rest of them had to come back and rebuild society. So they couldn't just sit around feeling sorry for themselves. But they had to do it in a very rigid and structured way. They couldn't just, they needed to protect this emotional fragility that they had. And they did that by making sure that children were seen and not heard. Children were told to tiptoe around on eggshells because if you upset grandpa or if you upset father, and they have a meltdown, there's going to be hell to pay. The wives had to behave in a certain way so as not to upset the apple cart. Don't provoke the husband. At work, the workers had to behave in a certain way. Everybody had to be yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. And the workers themselves very often also were at the front, also traumatized, so they appreciated that order in society. And as a result, people feared emotions, because if somebody had provoked father or grandfather and they did have a meltdown, the repercussions were hectic. I mean, they might, they might become an alcoholic. They might have a mental breakdown and have to be admitted to a hospital. They might start beating somebody in the family. There were dire repercussions to upsetting people's emotions. So there was a very healthy fear of emotions in those days, and people didn't mention it because it was actually really true. If you aggravated grandpa, he could so everybody had to keep the stiff the stiff upper lip. What was your experience of it as a child?
Well, my grandmother was very loving, had cuddles, whatever. My grandfather was grumpy. So you kept away from grandfather. You just didn't go there. So, and I'm not sure why he was like that, but it could have been the war, could have been bringing up big family, not too much money. But he was somebody you didn't play with or toy with. Whereas the love and the cuddles came from my grandmother.
Wow.
So,
interesting. And your dad, did he fight in the war or not?
No, I think he was a farmer, and I think he might have had a couple of health problems, but I think in those days, if you were a farmer and producing food, you didn't necessarily have to go to war. So and I grew up 4 years after the war had finished, so I don't really remember too much about it.
And your grandfather obviously didn't
discuss it. In those days, even if you spoke to somebody who had been in the war, they would just not want to talk about it. They just said it was just too terrible. I don't want to go there. And they kept it to themselves, and obviously that didn't help them coping with it.
Absolutely. So it makes sense, doesn't it?
So were kids stronger in those days than they are now, or is it just that people and children feel they can talk about it, whereas before it just didn't happen?
So I think one of the biggest changes with the modern children today has been the advent of social media. Because social media really magnifies all of these fears kind of in one place on a regular basis. So children are being repeatedly exposed to being rejected. They might get, not just dropped from the soccer team, but now it's made public, or they may go onto social media and find out that they were not invited to a party where everybody else was going. Those things are devastating to a child, and they're happening
and to an adult even.
Absolutely, because if you haven't processed it, absolutely it's going to affect you. So just as much as it would have if you were a child. So as a result, and this is happening on a daily basis, instead of in your day when you were a child, it might happen to you once or twice a year that you heard that somebody had a party and you didn't get invited. But for the most part, it wasn't an ongoing stress in your life. Whereas now they're having these devastating sort of revelations on a, a moment by moment basis, so long as they're attached to that social media.
So those things that are causing stress, it seems to be there's a groundswell of controlling social media going forward. Children under 16, I think, is in Australia now, maybe not be able to have the same social media contact. Do you see that changing over the years, that these things that stress people may be there may be more protection for kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a little bit like smoking. You know, I think that people smoked heavily for 30 years before they realized it was causing lung cancer and heart disease. So it's the same with social media. Up until now, we haven't really been aware of how badly it is affecting our children's emotions and their brains. So now that people are aware of it, they are definitely curbing the use of cell phones wherever they can, especially with children. I think us as adults also need to curb that because of the effect it has on our brains.
Well, Mandy, have you been down this road in your own personal life where you can tell us about your experience with stress and burnout? Is it something very personal for you as well?
Yeah, there is a personal aspect to it because, as I told you, I was a physiotherapist for 30 years. And as a physiotherapist, you work pretty hard. You know, the environment is that you have a patient coming in every sort of half an hour or 45 minutes. So you never get a break. You know, it's just constant. One person leaves, the next person walks in. The next, it can be quite draining. That in itself, I enjoyed being a physiotherapist, so it wasn't that wasn't a problem. But that in itself wouldn't probably cause burnout. But in addition to that, I loved sport, and I was very competitive in canoeing or kayaking, and was training for world champs and competitions like that, where you had to put in a lot of hours a week to get to the standards that you needed to. And I wasn't aware at the time of how much stress that puts on your body, that endurance exercise. I am aware now, and I've cut it back significantly, but at the time it was just all go.
Yeah.
In addition to that, I was running another business and often working until 9 o'clock at night. So I was really burning the candle at both ends. And as a result of that, started to have sleep issues and also an autoimmune disease, which is very often brought on by being overstressed. And I had to make some significant changes to my lifestyle. And it also put me on this path of like trying to figure out, why are we so stressed? Why is this happening to us? And how do we fix it? How do we make it better or help people to prevent this from happening to them, for sure?
And how do we get to a stage in our life that we're not overstressed and burnt out, that we have a lifestyle that we can cope with? How do we get to that stage?
You know, Jim, for everybody it's different. So it's because it's so individual. What we need to do is first sit down with a person and find out what's stressing them out. Because remember, these coping mechanisms or these compensation patterns, the reason why they are burning out or why their life has become unbalanced is because they keep doubling down. They keep doing the compensation pattern harder and faster. So if they're an overperformer, they start working longer hours, you know, and longer hours until it's unplayable. If they're a controller, they become micromanagers and won't get off people's cases. You know, if they're a perfectionist, they're also going to work longer hours to try and get the work done in their perfectionist way. So all of these things ultimately lead to an imbalance in your life because you become quite obsessed with one aspect that you believe innately that's keeping you safe and helping you survive, but it's actually self-sabotaging you. So if you can heal that, if you can help people to get to the bottom of that and free them of it so that it no longer drives them compulsively, then they're free to make different decisions. And often people have had quite radical life changes as a result of coaching. They'll suddenly realize, oh my God, I've been on this treadmill for decades and it's really not serving me. My health is suffering. My relationships have suffered. Some of them are on their second or third marriage by this stage, you know, so that they can see the track record of the destruction their patterns have caused. And once they're free of it, they can make completely different decisions. Because if you take that stressed out person before they've healed that, it stresses them out more to tell them to work less, to try and get them to balance their lives. They can't do it because they feel so unsafe. So you first have to create the safety. Once they have the safety, they then can calm down. Then their creative brain comes online, and then they start to create all kinds of different futures for themselves that have this balance, because they realize how important the health and wellness, the diet, the exercise, the sleep, they realize how important that is, and they factor that in, and they don't have to succumb to this drive to the sort of unquenchable drive to have more, more, bigger this, more money, more success, or whatever it is that they think is going to ultimately make them feel safe and okay in a modern